in, and we'll get started in about a minute here. Thank you. Okay, thank you everyone for joining us this morning. I'm John Espinal-Narn, editor of China Brief and China Program Manager here at the Jamestown Foundation. Today's discussion on the China-Russia strategic partnership comes at a timely juncture. We are 1 year removed from the Beijing Olympic Summit between leaders Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, which resulted in a joint statement in which the two sides both agreed there would be, quote unquote, no limits to their cooperation. And moreover, after that, we're 11 months removed from the onset of full-scale war between Russia and Ukraine in late February. Xi also has a new policy team that has taken the reins after the 20th Party Congress, and we'll have more clarity on that with the National People's Congress later this spring. And while there's been some modest reduction in tensions of late, the US-China strategic rivalry shows no signs of abating. Despite the ups and downs of the past year, both Russia and China have continued to emphasize the importance of maintaining and even deepening their strategic partnership. And there's been signs that the partnership remains robust. So just to give one example, over the first 11 months of 2022, two-way trade volume reached a record high. In his annual year-end call with Putin, Xi stated that in a changing and turbulent international environment, it is important that China and Russia remain true to the original aspiration of cooperation, maintain strategic focus, enhance strategic coordination, and continue to be each other's development, opportunity, and global partners to bring more benefits to the two people and greater stability to the world. Nevertheless, despite this high-sounding rhetoric, questions remain about how deep and extensive both the coordination and the cooperation is between leaders in Beijing and Moscow. So today, we're going to examine the level and extent of cooperation in three areas, which will be covered by our three excellent speakers. So first, we have Pavel Bayev, who's a non-resident senior fellow on the Center on the United States and Europe at the Brookings Institution. And he's going to talk us through the relationship between Xi and Putin, and more generally, the relationship between Chinese and Russian elites. Second, we have Maya Nuens. Maya is a senior fellow for Chinese security and defense policy at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, or IISS. And she's going to talk us through the military and security relationship, looking at military to military relations and arms sales. Finally, last but not least, I'm very glad to see him here. We have Sergei Sukhankin, who's my colleague, a senior fellow at the Jamestown Foundation and a advisor at Gulf State Analytics. And Sergei is an expert on private security companies and private military contractors. And he's going to look at the interaction and overlap between China and Russia in two areas, I think, where they're key actors, Africa and Central Asia. So with that, I've talked enough. Pavel, let's go over to you, and maybe you can get us started by talking about the relationship at the elite level. Thanks, Pavel.
Uh, Thank you, John. I'm very glad to be a part of this conversation. And there is a bit of a challenge for me because, in fact, not that much new is happening in this relationship. It's hard to find this kind of sharp reference point. Yes, Russia has a new ambassador now in Beijing, is a professional, mid-60s, speaks the language, but generally he is no match to his predecessor, Andrei Denisov, who was really very good in his job. Dmitry Medvedev paid a visit to Beijing, brought a letter from Putin to Xi Jinping, was received. Very little is known about the content. There was a conversation, video conversation between Putin and Xi Jinping. And in that conversation, I think what struck me was that the two readouts were quite different. With different emphasis, with different omissions, with very significant differences, but explaining them, I want to try to make a larger point. I generally feel we now have a different Putin and different Xi Jinping, a new quality in both. And certainly it's not that new, and it's not that new. In a sense, these two hyenas have not changed their spots, and the changes are not very recent. It's not this week. I think changes started in early autumn when there was a party congress in Beijing, certainly, and when Putin announced the annexation of 4 Ukrainian regions and mobilization. And I think at that moment, in expert community, there was a misinterpretation of the meaning of both events. As for Putin, I think the experts expected that this annexation would signify a significant increase in Russian assertiveness in the occupied Ukraine, probably a new offensive. And with Xi Jinping and Party Congress, I think the expert opinion thought there will be a new strengthening of central control, new consolidation of the same very rigid political line. And I think in early November, in mid-November, we both discovered that the assessments are not quite on target. Because Putin suffered a very humiliating defeat and had to withdraw from Kherson region. And Xi Jinping encountered, surprise, surprise, protests with blank pieces of paper, an old Soviet joke coming true. And at that moment, real changes started. That's where I think new qualities started to appear. And with Putin, it's clear where the quality is going. He is really going full in with the war. And special operation is still called special operation, but it is a very obvious change in the whole atmosphere in Russia, in propaganda, in mobilization of economy, in preparation of a military reform, that the war is becoming really the main thing. Putin reinventing himself as a war leader and trying to take the whole country on the war path. I can take a lot about that. I'm writing about this every week in Eurasia Daily Monitor. But I really want to point towards changes in Beijing, where I'm on much less certain ground. My expertise here is much thinner. But what I observe is that changes in Chinese politics go in a rather different direction from what has been expected. Much less central control, more flexibility, greater space for private enterprise, generally less tightening of all screws, and significantly more attempts to open up, to restore dialogue with various external partners, to invite back investors, particularly on the recent Davos forum, very obvious line, to convince them that it's not just a temporary deviation, but a real serious change, that the economic climate is becoming much more favorable for them again, as it used to be a few years back. And as a part of that new course, generally emphasis on de-escalation, on reducing tensions. And I think that the forthcoming visit by US State Secretary Antony Blinken to Beijing would consolidate this kind of trend, would show more of this change. And this change is really very worrisome for many in Moscow. The big hope in the Kremlin is about ever-growing tensions between China and the United States. That's the only way, in their perception, that US can be distracted from the European theater, from Ukraine, preoccupied with Asia-Pacific affairs. Russia would gain more freedom of hands, more freedom to launch its offensive. So these two changes in Chinese and Russian politics are generally going in different directions. They are diverging. Russia is becoming much more focused on war and going for greater, more rigid central control. And China is going for less tensions, for more opening, for reducing the confrontation, first of all, with the United States. And I think it's because of that we see these differences in the content of the conversation between Putin and Xi as presented into respective media. In Russian media, the point Putin made very strongly was on military technical cooperation. We will probably hear more about this in my presentation. But I don't think Xi mentioned that topic at all. Putin was very sent a very warm invitation to Xi to pay a visit to state visit to Moscow this spring. And in the readout from Xi, I haven't seen any word of thanks for the invitation, not to mention accepting it. In the readouts, what I saw on the Chinese side, there was a point that the war in Ukraine needs to be brought to an end. And there is no mention of Ukraine in the Russian readout at all. So there is discrepancies, probably, again, words are just words. And we shouldn't take the discourse for the real politics. But I think there is real evidence to put under the proposition of diverging political courses between Moscow and Beijing. For once, Russian military are in desperate need of every kind of equipment, from artillery shells to microchips to drones to tanks. And in all these kind of clashes, there are a lot of Russian equipment taken trophies or shot down. I haven't seen one bit with the words made in China. Equipment comes from Belarus and from North Korea. Drones come from Iran. Nothing at all comes from China, despite really desperate need in Russia on that. A different bit of evidence probably can be found on the energy market, where Russia is under increasing pressure from Europe, first of all, which is weaponizing, so to say, Russia's energy dependency and punishing it very, very severely. Russia is very desperate now to sell its oil, and from next week, pressure will increase further with the ban on the petroleum products. Russian officials and Putin, first of all, was very adamant that all this Western pressure will come to naught, that the attempts to enforce the price ceiling on Russian oil will be categorically rejected. And we see that this price ceiling works, that the spread in prices between Russian benchmark Urals and the Brent benchmark, which used to be kind of 3, 5, 10 US dollars, is now more than 30. Russian oil is selling really cheap. And China is a part of that, because Russians' attempts to sell more oil to China succeed only partly. China is taking a bit more than usual, and that explains the increase of the mutual trade, as you've mentioned, John, because oil was expensive last year. It is coming much cheaper now, and the price, which is earmarked in Russian state budget, 70 US dollars per barrel, is hardly going to be achieved, and China is a part of this problem. Russia cannot sell enough oil to China. Well, India is another part of the same problem, but I think China in this regard is more significant. There are other bits and pieces of evidence. We talk a lot in these recent weeks about Russia's activities in Africa, for that matter, about the Wagner Group, what they're doing there, what's the real purpose, what's the scope of these activities. More and more details come into surface because activities are quite secretive and clandestine in many regions. There are some new developments in Mali, in Burkina Faso, but I haven't seen any evidence of cooperation between Russia and China in Africa. In principle, the interests could be quite compatible. China needs resources from Africa. Russia doesn't, but Russia can provide some muscle for protecting Chinese investment, for that matter. It isn't happening. Wagners are doing their own dirty business with no connections, no communications with China. So my kind of bottom line from all this, there could be kind of more evidence presented, for instance, in the complete lack of cooperation in fighting the COVID epidemics, where vaccines are not mutually recognized and really no cooperation is happening. So it is not that I am picking up bits and pieces here and there which contradict the picture of ever deepening, ever strengthening, ever widening a strategic partnership. As the two states often say, high discourse, as you have mentioned, Joe. So my bottom line is, when you hear this high discourse, you probably need to increase the proverbial grain of salt into a full teaspoon, at least. I don't see this partnering strengthening. I see the two courses diverging, and I see problems increasing. I'll stop here. Don't want to give you a long lecture.
Thanks, Pavel. That was very insightful. I think I need maybe a whole shaker of salt here, but it's a great point. I think both capitals have a incentive, right, to project an image of closeness with one another, I think, at least rhetorically. So let's get a little more into the nitty gritty here. And Maya, let's turn to you, I think, for a topic that will be of great interest, I think, to much of our audience, which is the defense and security relationship. So Maya, over to you.
Thanks, John, and thanks for having me on. And it's great to follow such an excellent intervention from Pavel. So yeah, I've been asked to talk a little bit more about the Sino-Russian kind of military relationship, and I focused a little bit more in my research recently on the defense technological relationship between the two countries. So that's what I'll talk about mostly in my remarks today, with a little bit of extra thoughts at the end of this wider bilateral relationship in terms of strategic collaboration. But I think it might be useful to just reiterate a little bit quickly some information about the general context in which this relationship has occurred. I mean, John, you've already mentioned the February 4th statement in which both countries signed on to a limitless strategic partnership. And Wang Yi had said, and China has reiterated over time, that China is willing to work with Russia to take the bilateral relationship to a higher new level in a new era. I think in general, that relationship has been deepening over time, over the last decade or two, not just in trade and investment, but also in terms of political coordination, messaging and symbolism, and of course, also in terms of military coordination and exercises, such as joint exercises in the Indo-Pacific, which serve Chinese strategic interests in its own region, in the Far East. I would, however, note that though this is a deepening relationship, there have been some limits to the overall strategic picture here in military terms. There is more joint exercising, but how truly joint those exercises are, I think, has been questionable. So on the optics, there seems to be a lot more activity, and that doesn't necessarily mean that there's true integration of both militaries in defense technological terms or in operational terms. And so that is something to keep in mind when we hear a lot about this deepening relationship and this limitless strategic partnership moving forward. It's interesting to think about the defense technological relationship a little bit more closely because there has been such a shift in that bilateral balance of power between the two countries from where it started in the 1950s and 60s to where it is today, and what that might look like, in my perspective, very differently in the next few years following the consequences of Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine. From Chinese academics' perspective, when you read their papers, they say that the Chinese and Russian defense technological relationship has turned a corner, and that China obviously was once very dependent on the USSR and on Russia for defense-related technologies, but it's now considered more of a partnership of equals between the two countries as China's own defense industry has modernized and become more competitive over time. From the Chinese perspective, however, I don't think this is actually a limitless relationship. It's been mentioned a couple of times, and that might not be said as openly, I think, by government representatives. But certainly, if you look at academic writings from Chinese academics on the bilateral relationship, you'll see that they point to issues such as lack of trust and border security issues, differences in each other's political systems, historical grievances, tensions over each other's roles in Central Asia or the Arctic, and so on and so forth. So these tensions, I think, also have have had impact on the bilateral defense technological relationship as well. I think it's also really important that, though I agree, and I'll come to this at the end, that we are seeing less of a overtly and all-encompassing positive view of this bilateral relationship from Chinese writings and online commentary and just use of language. More recently, following the war of aggression in Ukraine, I think it is important to note that from the Chinese perspective, and I suppose from the Russian as well, this is always going to be viewed through the lens of US-China rivalry. And so no matter how frustrated the Chinese get, which they might very well be, the bigger picture here is still that both see a benefit and a use in this practical relationship in pursuit of a larger goal of a multipolar world and pushing back against the West. So in terms of this defense technological relationship, I think despite Chinese advances in its own defense industry, Chinese academics still very much point to Russian strengths in basic research, such as in areas of material science, mathematics, physics, aerospace, power efficiency, polar exploration, space science, so on and so forth. The bilateral military technological aspect of the relationship is viewed as complementary to other aspects of the Sino-Russian military political relationship and the Sino-Russian military operational relationship, which I've touched on just previously. And this defense technological relationship is viewed as being in terms of arms sales, in terms of defense technology transfers, and more recently having shifted and perhaps progressed to R&D collaboration in the defense technological field as well. In terms of arms sales, these have, as I said, ebbed and flowed over time, depending on political context and also Russian willingness to export and Chinese need for Russian exports. They have primarily focused on aircraft, air defense systems, engines, missiles, radars and sensors, and to a lesser extent, some capability and technologies in the naval domain. But over half of all of China's arms imports from Russia have been in the area of engines of various types, and of course in aircraft and missile defense systems. The arms sales have declined in recent years due, as I mentioned, due to a lack of need from the Chinese side for Russian capabilities, and also because of a lack of trust on the Russian side following years of Chinese reverse engineering of arms exports to China by Chinese defense companies. But arms sales have formed an important source of technology for China's defense industry. And they have, of course, also served as an important source of funding and foreign currency for the Russian military-industrial complex over time. So perhaps this decline in arms sales that we're seeing at the moment might just be a little bit of a pause. I'll talk a little bit about that in just a second. The defense technological relationship is developing, as I said, from a one-sided one, where the flow is very much of technology from Russia to China, to one where Chinese academics really view this one of equal learning, where there's a greater balance of power between the two countries and their defense technological abilities. China's economic and technological rise has allowed China to push back to what one Chinese academic has referred to as Russian chauvinism in the defense technological relationship. And China and Russia or have been or were until very recently, perhaps, moving forward to a relationship based on procurement of weapon systems and equipment and components to one of cooperative R&D and joint manufacturing as well. And an example of that would be perhaps joint cooperation on the development of emerging and disruptive technologies for dual use purposes, or as was mentioned publicly, joint cooperation on the research and development of a missile early warning system. I think it is important to note, though, that on that last point, that was heavily covered in the news, but there's not really much sense of progress on that type of R&D project. So understanding where exactly that currently is in its phase of progress is quite difficult to ascertain publicly. Or at least from public sources. So there is an element here of hope, or there was an element of hope from recent Chinese coverage of this defense technological relationship, but there are also, of course, obstacles to this deepening ties in this bilateral relationship. And some things here that should be pointed out is that there are still areas of defense technology that China would like to acquire from Russia, that Russia has withheld in terms of defense-related arms transfers from Russia to China. Think, for example, of the latest and most advanced of Russia's air defense systems, or the most advanced of Russia's fighter aircraft. In that sense, I think there has been continued mistrust in the military technological relationship. Chinese academics, or one Chinese academic that wrote about this, kind of tacitly acknowledged this concern on the Russian side in recent years about China's past history of reverse engineering, taking advantage of Russian defense technological intellectual property by saying that some Chinese-made weapons have similarities with Russian-made weapons in technical genes, which was a really flowery and poetic way of saying we've stolen and copied some of your technology. Actually, quite a lot in the past. I think there's also, so that provides an obstacle. I think the second obstacle may have been in the past that Russia, as an arms exporter, may have been nervous about China's increasing manufacturing capabilities and whether or not China's defense industry could, in the future, potentially compete with Russia for certain arms exports markets if Beijing did decide to ramp up production for arms exports in particular. But in general, whilst these might still be theoretical obstacles to deepening defense technological ties between the two countries, I think the war in Ukraine has really thrown a spanner in some of these obstacles and may actually present China with some opportunities. Russia's status as an arms exporter is likely to change following Russia's illegal war of aggression in Ukraine. And so perhaps this sensitivity around arms export markets might actually also weaken as a result. Russia is, of course, also becoming a junior partner in this bilateral relationship. So although we're still unsure of just how the war in Ukraine is going to impact Russia's science and technology strengths and abilities, it is possible that China, I think it's likely that China is now becoming a technological power in that bilateral relationship, that it's tilting more in China's favor. And also because of Russia's overall economic position, China might also find itself in an advantageous spot to potentially demand the transfer or sale of military technology that Russia has been withholding up to now from China, taking advantage of Russia's overall weaker position. I think we should be careful, however, to note that there are also challenges here for China. I mean, Pavel has spoken well about the frustrations, perhaps at the elite level. I think I agree with that. I think there have also been demands from kind of public reporting, at least, that Russia has requested China to help with defense technological and material assistance throughout the war. And that Beijing, of course, as we've noted recently, has been warned by the US publicly against this multiple times. Most recently, just in the last few weeks, I think the US government has said that it's investigating concerns that Chinese SOEs may have been supplying some military-related goods to Russia throughout the war, in addition to a closer trading relationship between the two. But details on what this exactly is and whether the Chinese government was conscious of this or not, I think are still unclear. But Beijing, I think, does really have to walk a fine line here between balancing and maintaining its relationship without limits, quote unquote, with Russia, which was once, from its perspective, also a potentially promising defense technological partner, and on the other hand, ensuring that this relationship doesn't negatively impact China's own national interests through, for example, risking secondary sanctions. And I think that's a very real concern. And yes, this overall relationship is not likely to change or to go away very, very drastically in the near future. As I said, that bigger picture remains of US-China strategic rivalry that Beijing will be factoring this relationship into. But on the other hand, Beijing doesn't tend to act in anybody else's interests other than its own. So here, I think, it's going to be interesting to see over the next year exactly how Beijing is able to maneuver through this relationship, its relationship with the United States, which Pavel rightly said, it is trying to put a floor under. I don't think this is a rapprochement between the US and China at all. I think we should be very, very cautious about this. China, economically and politically, coming out of 3 years of zero COVID policies, is finding itself in a very precarious position. We saw protests, large-scale protests in Chinese cities at the end of last year, which caused the CCP to revert on its dynamic zero COVID policy. We've also seen in the 20th Party Congress that she noted that the international and external environment to China is becoming increasingly critical and hostile to China. And so there's a lot of PR that needs to be made up here from China's perspective to reverse some of the negative impacts of China's external relations that have developed over the last few years. So I see this plus the willingness to put a floor in the U.S. relationship with China to put a floor into the bilateral U.S. and China relationship as a positive. But on the other hand, that doesn't change the overall strategic view that China has of the next 5 to 10 years and what that looks like. So I just like to end on a note of caution there. There are, of course, other things that we can talk about here with regards to impacts of the war in Ukraine on the Russian-China relationship, and potentially also China's calculations for future contingencies around Taiwan. But perhaps it's best to leave those for the Q&A as well if others are interested. And I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Maya. Yeah, I think that really gives us a good picture of the security relationship. It's certainly becoming much more symbiotic, much less asymmetric than it previously was a couple decades ago. And we'd love to get into some of the other things you discussed in the Q&A. So let's go over to Sergey now, and I think we're going to kind of test Pavel's hypothesis. Are Chinese and Russian relations in Africa and Central Asia really kind of running on separate tracks, maybe with occasional alignment? So Sergey, thanks for joining us, and I believe you have some slides you were gonna show.
Yes, good morning, John, and good morning from freezing Edmonton, Canada. John, one question for you. How can we pull up my slides? Should I do it myself?
Let me let you share the screen. Sorry.
Yeah, because I couldn't do that. I was trying to navigate.
You know what? Actually, let me just share my screen if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure.
Because I have it here. So, and we are not on your first slide. So there we go. Can everyone see the slides?
Yeah. Well,
okay, great. And I'm going to make sure that they're in slideshow view. So, all right. And just say next slide, Sergey. Sorry about this.
Sure. Oh, yeah, I'll do that. Yes, so good morning once again. And today I will be talking about China-Russia interactions or lack of thereof in Central Asia and Africa. So, John, could we go to the next one, please? Yes, and this is a brief agenda of what I will be covering today. So first, I will talk about China in Central Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa in terms of the main achievements, problems, and some prospects. Secondly, and I will be paying a marginal attention to this, and later I will explain why. Later I will be talking about Russia also in Central Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. And I will talk about some of the most recent developments and Russia's tools, the main instruments that Russia has been using in trying to maybe promote its agendas or maybe clinging to the vestiges of the past when operating in these regions. And finally, in the final analysis, I will talk about whether we can talk about whether it is legitimate to refer to Russia and China relationships or collaboration in the region as China and Russia, or maybe they're running their separate tracks. So in brief, in short, I agree with what Pavel said about Russia and China in Central Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, but now I'll give some general details about that. And could we go to the next one, please? Yes. Excellent. So basically, even though Central Asia and Africa, Sub-Saharan, I'm referring to Sub-Saharan Africa mainly, are located in very different parts of the world. So geographically, they are disconnected, though there are many qualities, there are many intrinsic characteristics that put a lot of connections or kind of bridges between these two regions, especially for China and to some extent to Russia. So first and foremost, both regions wield strategic and critical natural resources that are essential for different sites, different types of manufacturing, as well as satisfying needs of China in terms of some critical resources. The second important element here is that these regions, both of them, share a very high potential, including in production of green energy. The third aspect is that both regions wield a perfect geographic location and thus are of strategic interest, of great interest from logistical point of view. Unfortunately, this visual image does not demonstrate the third kind of route, which is the Polar Silk Road, but we are primarily interested in these two aspects. And of course, for China, both for China and Central Asia, especially when we are referring to, and this is particularly important when it comes to Central Asia, it is a matter of domestic and internal security. So basically, this macro region plays a strategic role. To a lesser extent, of course, Sub-Saharan Africa, but it is also important. I will talk about its importance in just a couple of minutes. Could we go to the next one, please? So let me first start with Chinese achievements and Chinese progress in Central Asia in this macro region. So here, instead of going into other or further detail, let me just share this visual image, which is a juxtaposition or a kind of a comparison of 2022 and 2021 in terms of overall growth in trade turnover between China and Central Asian countries. So the first and the most lucrative trade relationships are between China and Kyrgyzstan, followed by Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, and then Uzbekistan. So we can see that Chinese involvement in terms of trade, in terms of businesses, it is growing, it is increasing. And the nature, what is quite interesting here, the nature of Chinese involvement in Central Asia from business and economic point of view, it is also changing. So it is kind of shifting from from dealing in the realm, in the industry of natural resources to further activities in small and medium-sized enterprises, which is quite telling, quite remarkable, quite interesting, I would say. Could we go to the next one, please? But in Central Asia, China is facing a number of challenges. Some challenges are more pressuring, some more severe, others are less important, but still they do play a certain role. At least they did play a certain role just a couple of years during the acute stage of the Syrian civil war and developments in Libya. So one of the main challenges that China is facing in the macro region here in Central Asia is growing xenophobia. According to multiple reports, despite massive economic investments, despite some notable and noticeable infrastructural projects that China has undertaken in the region, the public perception of China has been on the decrease. And the year 2019, I was doing a research, I actually published a paper some time ago with China Monitor in Jamestown about activities of Chinese private security companies in Central Asia. The year 2019 was marked by the Kazakh, by some observers, by some Central Asian observers, as the year of xenophobia in Central Asia. And sometimes, on some occasions, this xenophobia took openly radical, openly acute forms. So China is serious, and Chinese, both the Chinese state and the Chinese businesses are seriously worried about tangible assets that China has in this macro region. And the second challenge is the fear of the threat of terrorism, which of course is it plays far lesser role than just xenophobia. Why? Because basically it is well, according to many estimates, the fear or the threat of terrorism has significantly subsided since 2015, 2016. And moreover, some Central Asian countries such as Uzbekistan, which despite all the political reforms, but despite all the domestic reforms, still remains a police state, and many things, many spheres of public life are still heavily controlled by the government. So basically, the fear of terrorism, even though it might appear on the surface, it doesn't really create such a menace for the Chinese. So what is the solution? What kind of a solution does China pursue, or solutions does China pursue in the region? So first, the traditional, quite typical no interference in public affairs approach, which has been working quite well for China, at least from image perspective. Also, China is, as it was demonstrated on the previous slide, China is increasing its investment, trade, and business activities, both within the region as well as with certain countries. And the third solution is related to security aspects, security domain, which we can define, which we can call conditionally either military or paramilitary cooperation. So starting from basically early 2000s, but then the activities increased, of course. China has had several notable joint paramilitary exercises with Kazakh, Tajik, Kyrgyz, and other governments. The second important aspect that needs to be admitted here is arms and weapons supplies. Frequently, China does this either on credit or completely free of charge, which is quite interesting because in the 1990s and until maybe the mid 2000s, Central Asia was viewed as kind of an area where the following maxim was applied: Russia's security. So Russia was the main security provider, while China was heavily investing and doing kind of business, trade, and things, moves related to economics. Now the situation is rapidly changing, especially after the outbreak of the war in Russia's unprovoked war of aggression against Ukraine. Then, of course, it's bases, or rather not military bases, but rather it makes sense to speak about security facilities that China is trying to implement, set in Tajikistan as a country that is not yet. As a country that is perhaps most endangered, from the security point of view, given its proximity, strategic geographic proximity to some of the main centers of regional destabilization. And of course, the last element is the use of private security contractors, private security companies. Now I'm working, basically I have already submitted a paper for Jamestown that discusses in depth with some, by the way, I took interviews from some notable security experts from Central Asia and working on Central Asia, including those who are nationals of Uzbekistan and other countries, so who know the environment first-handedly. The use of private security contractors and companies in the macro region. Although, of course, Chinese actions here may be a bit constrained, because in many countries, public perception runs completely against the use of any forms of security assistance, especially given the image and public perception of private security contractors. This may work well, and John, could we go to the next one? This may work relatively well in such a country as Kyrgyzstan, which is heavily indebted to China. But in other countries, again, based on opinions of experts that I communicated with, that I talked with in Uzbekistan, in Kazakhstan, well, let alone Turkmenistan, the local authorities, they are completely against any form or any forms of security assistance that take form or shape of private security contractors or private security companies. And of course, this image has stagnated, has aggravated further after the outbreak of Russia's war against Ukraine, when even sometimes experts, they confuse private military companies, private security companies, and private military and security companies. So in public image, in public perception, private security companies may take a form in a way tantamount to private military companies, or rather quasi-private military companies that Russia has been using since at least 2014 in different theaters. So this table shows some of the activities of some of the private security companies operating in Kyrgyzstan. Again, of course, the atmosphere is completely is not transparent. It's so it's very, very hard to ascertain what exactly they're doing there, in which numbers, but based on some bits and pieces of information, it's possible to kind of deduce some of these facts. Could we go to the next one? And a very, or rather, somewhat similar situation is taking place in sub-Saharan Africa. Actually, I'm now writing my next piece, a large paper for Jamestown on Chinese activities in sub-Saharan Africa, in Anglophone part of Africa, and the next another piece will be about activities of Chinese private security contractors in Francophone Africa. So here are a couple of just interesting facts about the extent and the level of Chinese involvement in this macro region. So China is the key investor in sub-Saharan Africa in general. The top 5 African destinations for Chinese, well, in some reports they call it foreign direct investments. From business and economic point of view, these are not strictly foreign direct investments, but let's call them this way for 2020 were Kenya, Democratic Republic of Congo, South Africa, Ethiopia, and Nigeria. Then 84% of China's Belt and Road investments are, and this is very important, this I think is, this will play a very key role, I would say, in the development, in the trajectory of the development and the use of private security contractors in the region. Investments are in medium to high risk countries. Another one is between 2007 and 2020, China's 2 main overseas development banks banks invested some 23 billion in infrastructural projects across Africa. By August 2022, so very recent data, China's official Belt and Road website listed 52 African countries taking part in the Belt and Road initiative. In 2020, the number of Chinese workers in Africa was down as compared to 2019, but in fact, it was mainly due to COVID, and Chinese workers, as well as Chinese tangible assets being placed in Africa, poses one of the key challenges for China, and I'll talk about this in just a second. And what is also interesting with regards to sub-Saharan Africa is that there is an interesting trend that is taking place there, in a way maybe somewhat similar to what we are seeing, what we are observing in Central Asia, but from slightly different perspective, which is read as Chinese money, Western security. It doesn't work the way it used to. In many ways, this could be traced to unsuccessful missions in Sahel G5 region. I wrote two pieces actually on this, with Russia allegedly trying to get inside the macro region, but never actually doing this, and to the extent that it was projected, or it was theorized by Western experts, because there is a lot of bottlenecks and hurdles when jumping in this region. In many ways, this goes hand in hand with Russia's unsuccess in Mozambique, where the Wagner Group suffered a humiliating defeat a year and a half, I think, ago. And as a result, basically the local authorities commissioned services of South African contractors and Zimbabweans in Cabo Delgado province, which is handsomely endowed with natural gas, but very, very complex from operational point of view in terms of political risks. Could we go to the next slide, please? And also here is the summary of the kind of the main challenges that and solutions also that China is using, China is implementing in its operations in sub-Saharan Africa. So the first, and here perhaps one of the main problems, is the fear of terrorism and extremism, which constitutes a much larger problem than in Central Asia. Of course, in many ways, because institutions here, the local institutions in many of these countries, are by far weaker than in Central Asia. And the Jamestown Foundation, its terrorism monitor, has done a fantastic job discussing and describing all the developments, breaking down all the developments in Africa by geographic principles. And what we can learn, what we can see from this multiple analysis, is that the situation across Africa is aggravating, stagnating. In fact, by the way, one of the most recent reports by the United Nations, it also says that the threat, the specter of terrorism, extremism is increasing. And what is worth is that terrorist and extremist activities are tightly knitted with the second element that I'll talk about in just a second, is banditry and organized crime, which in sub-Saharan Africa represents a huge challenge. For instance, one of the most I would say widespread means that the locals use to extract money from the Chinese is kidnapping, or are kidnappings for ransom. Now, when I'm working on this paper about sub-Saharan Africa, basically the instances of Chinese workers, Chinese engineers, Chinese nationals at large being abducted for ransom in sub-Saharan Africa, it's substantial to significant. One of the main problems here is the belief of many Africans or many representatives of local organized criminal groups is that all the Chinese companies are wealthy as Crassus, and one can get a lot of money by abducting their personnel, while in fact, well, many Chinese companies actually operate in Africa. They're trying to cut down the costs, and they do not commission or procure services of professional private security contractors. And some solutions. So basically, the first solution is in many ways very, very similar to what we see, to what we can observe in Central Asia's trade, investment, and non-interference in the domestic affairs of local countries. And by the way, this gives a very good, very positive, I would say, outcome for China. In fact, the Afrobarometer regularly says that public perception of China in Africa is very good. In fact, and this is quite interesting, that it is particularly good among the African youth. It is almost as good, basically, almost similarly good as the perception of the United States. So basically, China and United States are the best perceived large actors, large players in sub-Saharan in this macro region. The second important tool is UN mandated missions, where China is trying to kind of play a certain role, and its involvement in these operations is increasing. So China is also working on this component, unlike Russia, by the way, whose contribution to UN missions in sub-Saharan Africa in this macro region has been minimal. And of course, the activities of Wagner Group, perceived or real, they do not definitely add any credibility to Russia, or do not influence in a positive way its image. And the final thing, the last aspect here, is the activities of private security contractors. I won't go into the details here. I want my paper to be published first, so I don't want to provide extra information. Some of the pieces have not been corroborated, so I'll just articulate importance of this. Could you go to the next slide, please? I could share with you it's not mine, the table is not mine. I took it from another study. The Chinese security companies operating in Africa, which demonstrates that in addition to land-based contractors, China is also using some of the security providers that are authorized for maritime operations, which I think is quite interesting, quite telling. And it's interesting. I mean, I haven't measured the rate of success or anything, but unlike China, Russia got into trouble in, I believe, 2013 or 2020. I think it was 2012, sometime between 2010 and 2013 in Nigeria, trying to do something related to these activities when the crew was busted, and basically there was a real serious problem with Nigerian police and even the Nigerian government. So for Chinese, at least for now, this has been working quite well. Last thing here, could we go to the next slide, please? There are certain problems, and there will be certain problems with Chinese use and Chinese potential reliance on private security contractors or even military bases in Africa. So first of all, the African public opinion is strongly against China or any other country, including Russia, by the way, at least in major countries. I'm not talking about the Central African Republic or some pariah states, but rather in major players, public opinion runs strongly against any major power using African territories to spread and promote the use of the private military security companies or establishing military bases. The use of private security contractors, at least in my opinion, might in a way contradict China's image building approach, which typically rests on promotion of soft power, trade, business ties, economic collaboration. And of course, the last element here is that the more, in case China chooses to use private security contractors to a greater extent, basically this might put them on a public display, and this is one of the things that the Chinese political regime would want to avoid. So this brings me to the last point. Basically, yes. Oh, sorry, no, not the last point. John, do I still have time, or should I be wrapping up? Sorry, you're muted.
Yeah, if you want to maybe just say a few more words and then we can kind of quickly go to Q&A. So this is great.
Okay, yeah, so to the last slide. So basically, yes, so China and Russia, or China via Russia. So basically, in key areas, including business and trade, Russia is not a rival to China in any way, neither in sub-Saharan Africa nor in Central Asia. Russia's role has been on the decrease, even in Central Asia, well before its war of aggression against Ukraine. Today, it's even lower. And I think that in such countries, especially in Kazakhstan, the largest and the main player, it will be decreasing. In terms of soft power, of course, again, the gap is also widening and not in Russia's favor. And in terms of military power, Russia's image is getting rapidly tainted due to its multiple unsuccesses, multiple failures in Ukraine, and we'll see what is going to happen later with the advent of more advanced Western weaponry. And what this means is basically China and Russia are unlikely, in my opinion, again, to pursue any joint actions in Africa and or Central Asia that would be of strategic nature. So there might be some temporary ad hoc cooperation or engagements, but I don't believe that China and Russia will be pursuing any strategic actions in this region. And most importantly, this is one interesting thought that I found in work of one Russian academic who critically assessed connections and developments of Russia-Chinese ties. He openly wrote that, in fact, the most crucial aspect is that from cultural civilizational point of view, China does not see Russia as an Asian power. And whatever Russia does, basically its image in China will be very, very different from what it really wants to achieve. On this, thank you, and sorry for taking more time.
Well, that's really good, Sergey, and I, appreciate that kind of granular level of research and looking at the situation in Central Asia and Africa. So I think it does I'm coming away from this that it really is on two tracks, the relationship between, and there's, so I would like to just open it, go straight into audience question and answer, because we have such a great audience here with us today. And we have a question here from Joseph Bosco that I want to go to first. And I guess a quick housekeeping thing for Q&A. You can either type a question in the Q&A box on your Zoom module, or raise your virtual hand and ask a question in person. So let's go to Joseph Bosco's question first. And he asks, is there any sense of how Russia's war in Ukraine has affected China's plans for aggression against Taiwan? Maya, I think this has your name written all over it.
Thanks. Look, I think there's no evidence in public source that this has either shifted a timeline forward or back. I think there's only one person who knows what those plans are, and that's Xi Jinping, and that will not be discussed publicly. So I'm wary to make any kind of predictions about that, and I don't think we necessarily should. But I think there have been interesting discussions about what the PLA might be learning as a result of Russia's performance in the war in Ukraine. And although the comparison between the war in Ukraine and a Taiwan contingency are very different, there are some general lessons that may be learned. The question here is, are the lessons that we think the Chinese might be learning from Russia's performance in the war in Ukraine the same as the lessons that the Chinese are actually learning about the performance from the performance of Russia in the war in Ukraine? And that, I think, is something that we still need to watch for moving forward. It's clear that, there's been some writing in Chinese sources about things like the difference in a Taiwan contingency in terms of resupply for the Taiwanese that will be problematic. And so we've seen some evidence that there will be a greater emphasis on targeting and activity around and of Taiwan's eastern coast, where if any resupply would be coming through, that would be most likely. But on the other hand, we know that that has been a plan for a while now, with PLA exercises actually mocking up certain small ports on Taiwan's East Coast, and capabilities being developed to target the Taiwan's East Coast, and of course PLA Navy activity along Taiwan's East Coast. So again, is that really new, or is that just a reinforcement of lessons that they already knew from modernizing and looking at a Taiwan contingency, which is the number one contingency that the PLA has been preparing for over time? There's also, of course, political and economic lessons that could be drawn from this in terms of response, Western unified response to Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine, how lessons about economic resilience in China's side, lessons about decreasing dependencies on China's side, and abilities to counter sanctions if that is the case. There will, of course, be lessons about how long this unity in the West actually lasts as well. I mean, if this is a question of short-term pain for a Taiwan successfully achieving a forced reunification with Taiwan, whereby economic sanctions lead to Chinese domestic economic pain and over a few years, then perhaps that's worth it, rather than, if at least this core interest has been delivered upon from the CCP's perspective. But overall, there hasn't been, I think, this huge shift in risk calculus from the PLA's or CCP's perspective that I can point to as a result of this. But it is something to watch.
Great. Anything to add there, Pavel or Sergey? There's always talk, right? Or there was fear, I think, before Russia invaded Ukraine, right? That Russia and China might kind of sync up their actions, right? And force the US into a two-front, or even, if you add in Iran and North Korea, multi-front contingency. But obviously China didn't, Russia went ahead and China didn't. Is there disappointment in Moscow that China didn't kind of shake things up a little more in Asia?
I think, looking from Moscow, every Chinese step in de-escalating tensions in Asia is a disappointment. I think Russia really counts very much on the second front appearing in Asia. Russia is quite surprised with the strength of the Western coalition, not only in Europe, but also spreading to Asia. There is a lot of attention in Moscow now to the new Japanese military doctrine, to the changes in Japanese military strategy. I was really surprised about the volume of commentary on this matter, because, again, Ukraine certainly dominates everything. But on a more general note, I think China is much better learning lessons from Russia's disasters than Russia itself. China studied very carefully the collapse of the Soviet Union and many other things, and I think China now is studying real lessons of this war in a much more consistent way than Russian generals and Russian politicians are able to.
Yeah, I completely agree with what Pavel said, and just to add to this, it's been too many disappointments for Russia, including the Balkans, where Russia was really looking forward to stagnation, maybe even a small paramilitary conflict or some kind of hybrid conflict, which never happened. Moreover, there are talks that Serbia might join anti-Russian sanctions. We'll see where this goes, but I think another knife in the back, as Russian propaganda cheerleaders are saying. So yeah, I completely agree with what Pavel said.
Great. We'll move on to the next question. It is a really interesting point about the impact on Ukraine, on Japan's security thinking. And, Japan, I think it's remarkable, this overhauling its security doctrine and the sort of amount that Japan has moved. I think what's really interesting there is that we saw at APAC, right? Kishida Fumio, right, and Xi Jinping met, right, and they actually put out a 5-point consensus on improving relations, right? But then at the same time, Japan took these very strong steps of strengthening its military, is now just signing on to U.S. Semiconductor sanctions or semiconductor export controls. So when I look at Japan in Asia, it's kind of as sort of speak softly and carry a big stick. So there may be some lessons there, I guess, for Washington. That's my one editorial point. Let's go over here back to the other questions. And we have a great question. I think I'm going to butcher this name, but from Gregor Kaczynski, who asks, do you agree that Russia is losing Central Asia to China? And does the current Russian regime see it that way? So, Sergey, let's go back to you and have you tackle this one again.
Yeah, that's a really great question. In fact, before the outbreak of war, Russia's war against Ukraine, I read an article by Sergei Karaganov, who used to be an advisor to Russian presidents and probably still serves in some capacity, because whatever he was saying, he was kind of talking about the war, or kind of that the war is immediate and it's going to happen very soon, a big war in Europe, and did happen. So, but in any case, what he wrote was quite interesting. He said that, we should really abdicate from the idea of Russia being or playing a certain role in Central Asia. As he said, we don't need Central Asia. We can basically agree with China in a way taking over Central Asia. He said that one of the main problems of the Soviet Union, one of the main, at least to him, one of the main factors that led to the collapse of the USSR was that the Soviet Union, Russia was investing its resources, investing its effort in those territories that either never really belonged to Russia or were only extracting or distracting Russia from its activities on other fronts. And that came to me as a surprise when Karaganov himself said that basically Russia doesn't need Central Asia. If China is so much interested in Central Asia, let it be Chinese. Let us allow China to be the dominating power in Central Asia, which will be the main means for us to avoid, for Russians, to avoid conflict with China and divert completely to this turn, to the pivot to the East policy, which was kind of telling, and I think it in many ways or should be answering this question. So yes, Russia is withdrawing from Central Asia. There are objective and subjective things here in many ways. As I said before, the role of Russia in Central Asia was on the decline, starting basically from the early 1990s. And even during the Soviet time, starting from the late 70s, that was one of the most problematic, aside from the Baltic states, of course, republics, one of the main problematic subjects or areas in the Soviet Union internal policy. So I think that morally, Russians are kind of in the Kremlin, in Moscow, they are kind of fine with or agreeing that it is China that should be playing the key role in Central Asia. I may be wrong, but maybe Pavel or Maya have something to add.
Wow. Okay, that's a remarkable insight, Sergey. I think that's fascinating. Maybe that. So it sounds like Russia is almost willing to make sort of accommodations to China's strategic interests, but not necessarily. Am I reading too much into that? But like they're almost willing to make special accommodations for China. I guess that makes okay. Let's go on to one more question, I think, before we close out for today. And I thank all the panelists for being generous with their time. I think this is a good question about India's role in all this, right? So, you know, how does that factor into this relationship, right? Because we know that India has a decent relationship with Moscow, right? And there's the legacy of that whole relationship, right? But then there's the relationship with China. So how does that kind of triangle factor in? Any thoughts on that? Maybe Pavel, if we can maybe go to you to start.
All right. Yes, it is a very difficult triangle. And for that matter, one evidence is that every time we see tensions, clashes, border clashes between China and India, one would suppose Russia is ideally positioned to mediate, to bring them together, to come with some initiatives, not a single time. And I think the lack of trust in both China and India in Russian mediation is probably the main explanation. But overall, Russia is really caught in between its traditional ties with India and its strategic partnership with China, and really cannot find a good way to balance these two commitments, and adding up, compromising both. Much the same way as Russia ties with Vietnam has weakened very, very clearly, partly because China was never pleased with that, and partly because Russia really cannot offer much to Vietnam. Much the same way in Russia's ties with India, I think there are now more weaknesses than strengths, and probably even the arms export, which used to be one of the backbones of these relations, is said to be much reduced, because Russia just cannot offer India anything of interest, and because India probably would think twice about Russia as a reliable arms supplier.
I'm not in India.
Sorry, yeah, please. No.
It's just a really quick intervention. I'm not an India expert, so I can't pertain to speak for or any real authority on this issue. But maybe just one consideration on that arms exports front, which I think is a really important element here of kind of the China-India tensions as well, which have been flaring up from time to time along their disputed border over the last couple of years, particularly during COVID as well, as we saw. I mean, here the question is, there is, I think, a growing concern about the capabilities of the Indian armed forces vis-a-vis rising tensions with China, and so how this now conundrum with a dependency on arms exports from Russia is going to be solved in the next few years, I think, is something to really watch. We have seen China move some of its equipment more to the Western theater and along its border with India, and although India is not the main contingency that China is concerned about, the PLA is preparing for, it certainly is, I think, featuring into this concern in China as well of a potential situation where China needs to look both east in a Taiwan contingency, potentially also west. So I think the issue of India has moved slightly up in China's considerations of potential areas or flashpoints or areas of concern for the PLA to focus on. But really, I think here the bigger problem is going to be on India's side as well, of how to deal with this dependent relationship on the Russian arms export market and where to go from there.
And just from my side, just one quick remark. So I'm more interested in business and economic ties between India and Russia, and specifically three main things. First, the oil price cap, because just 2 weeks ago, in one outlet and then in other outlets, in Russian outlets, it was said that Indian government is considering joining, basically de facto joining Western sanctions against Russian oil producers if the price of oil exceeds $60 per barrel, which is quite interesting. So Indians are only interested in purchasing Russian oil with a significant, huge, I would say, even discount. So how things will play out if Russia's oil is above 60, probably India might want to join the anti-Russian sanctions, and then why China could not do the same, maybe behind under the scenes, but still quite interesting. The second aspect, in my opinion, also very interesting, is related to the decision to trade in national currencies. The main problem here is that in the trade balance between Russia and India, there is a huge imbalance. So basically, Russia is selling India, given the mounting exports of oil, Russia was selling, I believe it was 23 billion, and India was selling to Russia up to 2.3 billion, something like this. So for India, it makes very little sense to continue trading with Russia on these terms and extend or expand their trade relations. And the third aspect is cooperation in the domain of defense industrial complex. Actually, it became known just a couple of weeks ago that one of the submarines that was to have been repaired by Russia and delivered to India didn't work out. Why? Because of the economic sanctions on Russia and all these things. So for India, in many ways, collaborating with Russia if sanctions stay, or if they expand even, makes very little sense. So basically,
Fantastic. Some great insights there. Yeah, I mean, it makes me think back to 2014 after Crimea, right? And we heard a lot about Russia pivoting to Asia, right? And they were going to deepen economic ties with India, Japan, South Korea, Vietnam, Southeast Asia, and China. And it seems to have become really just a pivot to China mainly. So, but I guess I want to thank our panelists today. I want to give them a chance, I guess, any last words to say before we head away, things to watch for in 2023. I guess, Pavel, Maya, Sergey, any last words? Great. All right, well, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. You can view this video on our website, jamestown.org, or our YouTube page. And you can read Sergey and Pavel's writings on China Brief and Jamestown, and Maya's IIS, and hopefully we'll get her to write for China Brief soon. So, really thank everyone for taking their time. This has been a fantastic panel, and I learned a lot speaking to you all. So have a good weekend, and thank you all. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you. Bye.